Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Welcome to this edition of the series of seminars on the COVID research. My name is Cedric T. from the Graduate Institute in Geneva. I'm very happy to welcome today Jonathan Dingel from the University of Chicago Booth Schools, who will tell us about his recent work with Brent Neiman about how many jobs can be done at home. We're all aware now that giving seminar is a job that can be done from home and listening to them, but that's more an exception than the rule. So Jonathan, thank you, welcome. Before we start, let me remind you of some quick rule of the roads. So Jonathan will be speaking for 40 minutes. Then we will have 20 minutes of questions and answer. If you have burning comprehension questions, you can put them through the Q&A options that you should have at your screen, and I will convey them to Jonathan. Once we move into the Q&A session, you can raise your hand and Mariolina will unmute you so you can ask your question, or you can still put questions to the Q&A option. I will keep an eye on it and I will bring them forward to the floor. So with it, without further ado, Jonathan, thanks, and the floor is yours.
Hey, great, Cedric. Thank you very much. I'm going to start sharing my screen, so hopefully you can all see this now. So this is a joint project with Brent Neiman, and compared to a lot of papers in economics, I probably don't have to do very much work to motivate this one. The question, how many jobs can be done at home, came to us in a very straightforward way. In the middle of March, the University of Chicago sort of shut down campus, sent the students home, sent the staff home, sent the faculty home. And so I went from teaching my MBA students in the classroom to recording videos about the class material and meeting with the students via Zoom. And so Brent and I had the conversation, very natural, about, well, this has been a somewhat costly transition. I had to learn some new digital tools and change some teaching methods. But on the whole, being an economist is pretty compatible with working at home in the sense that I was able to move my teaching online and my research workflow wasn't that different in terms of communicating with co-authors all over the world, working on the computer servers at Chicago, etc. And so Brent and I simply asked, how many people have jobs like, economists at research universities in terms of it being a relatively straightforward transition to switch from working in the office to working at home. And in the context of the pandemic, this is an important question for a whole bunch of issues that we care about in terms of thinking about what we're going to be going through. And so now we've all had 2-3 months of experience of working at home. But when we started writing this paper, remember this was sort of mid to late March. And so it was very early in terms of the course of the pandemic and thinking about its big economic consequences. And so knowing the fraction of jobs or fraction of occupations that can be performed at home is important for thinking about a number of questions, including what's the supply side hit that you're going to take in the sense of if the government imposes shelter in place or stay at home restrictions and you're not allowed to go into the office, that's just going to take a fraction of the labor force offline in terms of their labor is no longer going to be supplied to those firms, those businesses. Thinking about what regions are going to be shut down by those kind of restrictions. And then thinking about what kind of industries are in a better or worse position in terms of being able to pivot to remote work. There's a small fraction of industries that are already, working remotely in terms of being geographically distributed, but for the vast majority of economic activity before the pandemic, it was being done face-to-face in person. And so the question is, what kind of businesses are going to be more or less hurt by these new restrictions? And then thinking about, important consequences in terms of welfare, what kinds of workers, what kind of households are going to be in better or worse positions, are going to be more or less vulnerable in terms of the economic hit that this involves. If you're told that, you can't work from home, it means either that you're going to take an economic loss in terms of losing your income that's associated with your job if you can't go perform it, or it means that in order to earn that income, you have to go out and be there face-to-face in person, which means that you're bearing the elevated health risks that are associated with this infectious disease at this point. And so there's just a series of questions that depend on the answer to how many people can work from home in terms of thinking about the economic consequences of the pandemic. And initially we were thinking about our own situation in Chicago and the United States, but then clearly there's very heterogeneous circumstances across the world, and this is a global pandemic, so we also turn to think about the variation across countries in terms of economic consequences. Okay, so the paper's pretty straightforward. We ask how many jobs can be plausibly performed entirely at home. And so that word entirely will wind up being a little bit important in terms of how we talk about measurement and how you interpret our number. So the question we're answering is, can you do your job completely from your home office? And so in the case of, being an economist, doing research, presenting via Zoom or WebEx or these other technologies, our answer was, our experience was yes, but we wanted to know how many jobs were like this where you could do it completely from your residential location. And so what we do in the paper is produce occupation level measures of feasibility of working at home. And we do that using US surveys that I'll walk you through in some detail that describe work context and activity. So we're going to use a method that's based on job characteristics in terms of describing what you do and then saying, can you do that at home? And this has a history in a number of different fields in labor economics and international trade. Brent and I were kind of inspired by the work of Alan Blinder on offshore ability from about 15 years ago. So around 2004, 2005, there was a lot of discussion about offshore outsourcing and a lot of interest of how many jobs might be departing developed economies and move to low-wage offshore locations. And Alan Blinder's exercise was to go through a list of occupations and say, could this be done offshore? And that was an influential piece in terms of providing a guide to what is potential. Not that these necessarily in equilibrium will go offshore, but that the task is offshoreable. And so that's the measure we sort of started with. And then it's clear that offshoreability is distinct in the sense that, for example, textile manufacturing is described as being offshoreable. And clearly it is in the sense that you can have an overseas textile manufacturing plant, but that makes it clear also that at least given current technologies, you can't produce textiles in the comfort of your own home, which means that offshoreability and the ability to do a job at home are distinct concepts. And so we went through the set of occupations to produce a measure of what could be done at home, echoing that sort of what's possible. We're looking at a sort of feasible production possibility in order to describe this. And the answer we come up with in the paper is that in the United States, about 37% of jobs, which account for 46% of the wage bill, can be done entirely at home. But there's a lot of variation across, of course, occupational categories, but also across industries and across cities. And so I'll describe some of that to you. And then we extended our results to look at 85 other economies besides the United States. And that involves some more assumptions about how we map our US-based measure to the occupational composition of foreign economies. But when we do that, the very striking pattern that subsequent work has generally agreed with is that in lower income countries, a small fraction, a much smaller fraction of the jobs can be performed at home. Okay, so my roadmap for today is I'm going to try to do 5 things. I'm going to first just talk about our definition, how we classified occupations as able to be performed entirely at home. Then I'm going to, after reporting the results, try to make clear what our classification does and does not measure, because there's been a lot of follow-on work and use of our measure, and we want to sort of talk about what it captures and the appropriate interpretation, and also what it doesn't necessarily capture. And then third, I'll talk about the extension to looking at other economies outside the United States and describe how many jobs can be done at home in 86 different economies. And then the last 2 points will be stepping a little bit beyond the paper and certainly what appeared in the first issue of COVID Economics in terms of talking about now people are providing real-time evidence of who is working at home during this pandemic. So we wrote this in late March. By the first week of April, people had started running online surveys, trying to figure out what the state of the labor market is. So I'll talk about other people's research in terms of the real-time evidence and what we've learned about working from home during this pandemic. And then finally, at the end, I'll say a little bit about the future of remote work and a little bit more speculative material in terms of whether we think working from home is going to become a permanent feature of the economic landscape for a lot of workers, or if we think that we're going to be going back to the way things were, circa 2019 after this pandemic passes. Okay, so that's where I'm headed in this talk. Let me start by telling you what we did. As I mentioned, we were kind of inspired by the work of Alan Blinder and these other papers in labor economics that use job characteristics in order to produce statements about production possibilities, what is feasible. And the reason we wanted to do that is if you were to look at statistics from last year or pre-pandemic about how many people were working at home, you would find very small numbers. So the Office of National Statistics in the UK had a survey in 2019 that said that 5% of people were working primarily from home. 29% of the UK labor force had worked at home at all. And you see similarly small numbers in US data. If you use something like the American Time Use Survey, you're gonna get single-digit numbers for people that are working the majority of their time at home. And that's because in 2019 and earlier, those surveys are describing, do you work from home, which is the equilibrium outcome. And heading into the pandemic, what we were interested in was what was possible given the shock that was gonna try to move a lot of people home. We wanted to know what was gonna be possible. So in order to produce that measure of what's feasible, we turned to the survey, a series of surveys that are conducted by the Occupational Information Network, ONET, which is a program in part sponsored by the US Department of Labor. And we used two surveys, one on work context and one on generalized work activities, that for more than 900 occupations, describe these occupations in quite rich detail in terms of what are the tasks that you perform and what are the importance of those different things that you do. So the first set of questions, we use a total of 17 questions from two different surveys. The first block of questions comes from the work context survey, which just describes the conditions in which you're working. And the approach that Brent and I took to this was to say, let's start from the presumption that everybody can work at home and then look in the job descriptions for conditions that would make it impossible for you to perform your job in its entirety from your home office. And so we'll start from the presumption that you're able to work at home and then say if any of the following conditions are true, we're going to code that occupation as unable to be performed at home. So if you say that you work outdoors every day, or that you deal with violent people on a regular basis, or if you're exposed to disease or infection or get minor cuts or burns or cuts, or bites, or you spend a lot of time walking or running, or if you spend the majority of your time wearing common or specialized protective or safety equipment, that indicates that you've got the kind of job that can't be performed from your home office or from your living room, in the sense that you're physically engaged outdoors wearing safety equipment, restraining violent people, stuff like this. And we also chose to leverage this email question. If you use email less than once per month, we're going to infer from that the nature of your tasks means that they're not very amenable to doing it from your home office. So this first block of questions describes the work context. And the second block of questions we used came from an ONET survey called generalized work activities. And so we code these occupations based on these questions. Ask the respondents about the importance of different tasks for the occupation. And so if it's said that it's very important to inspect equipment and structures, or to handle and move objects, perform general physical activities, operate a vehicle, repair machinery or equipment, or perform or work directly with the public, then we're going to say that it is not possible to do that while working at home. These elements mean that you need to be physically engaged and can't be doing the work remotely. And so between the previous slide and this slide, that's the set of 17 conditions. And if any of those conditions are true, then we say that you're not able to perform your job at home. So that gives us a 1 or 0 for 900 different occupations in terms of could you do this at home or not. So for us, it's a binary indicator. The subsequent literature has sometimes tweaked this to make it more a continuous measure in terms of there's 17 conditions. You could take averages instead of saying if any of them are true. My read of the literature is that doesn't change conclusions very much. I'll mention this a little bit more later, but there was researcher judgment involved here in terms of choosing these questions. And so some people have chosen different questions when going to different surveys. We were, I think, being conservative in saying these are clearly conditions that would rule out your ability to perform this at home. Some people have chosen survey questions to generate something like a measure of face-to-face interaction using things like, is it important to communicate information to your coworkers? Or do you manage or supervise other people? And it's true that in the pre-pandemic office environment, a lot of that would have been face-to-face interaction. It's not so clear to Brent and me that that has to be face-to-face. I've been working from home for almost 3 months now, and I manage and supervise my research assistant remotely. And Brent and I wrote this entire paper without ever being face-to-face. We did it entirely over Zoom and Dropbox, essentially. So we wanted to be relatively conservative. So for something that has this broad notion of communicating or coordinating with other people, we would say that that can be performed remotely. It doesn't necessarily have to be face-to-face. And so that's how we chose sort of this set of questions. Okay. So the result of coding things this way is that we get scores for occupations at this fine 6-digit level of detail. What this table does is summarize these at the 2-digit level of detail for the US standard occupational codes. So we take those 800 occupations that are yes, no, you could work at home or you can't, and then aggregate them up using the number of people employed in each of those 800 some occupations to produce these 2-digit level averages. So these are weighted averages using US employment counts for the occupations as the weight. And so we've ranked them from those that can be done most at home to those that cannot be plausibly performed at home at the bottom of the table. And so at the top of the list, you see computer and mathematical occupations, where these survey measures imply 100% of them could be done at home. Very high scores for education, legal, business, management, etc. At the other end of the spectrum, you have 1% or 0% for farming, production, installation, maintenance and repair, food prep and serving, building and grounds cleaning and maintenance, right? And so that's what we get out of the ONET score. There's some very high scores clustered near almost 100%, a number of literal zeros, and then a bunch in between. And architecture, life, physical, social sciences, sales and related occupations, personal care, and services. And notice this is clearly a feasibility measure. Brent and I got a little bit nervous in the sense that when we did this, we got education, training, and library occupations. So I think there are about 8 million teachers in America, and we're saying 98% of them could be working from home. And I think pre-pandemic, that would have sounded very implausible. But as we've all gone through this experience, now there's questions about quality and productivity, and I'll come back to that. But this is about the feasibility of performing the occupation from home. A lot of people have turned to learning online. Even middle school teachers or even some elementary school teachers, which is perhaps surprising, but is indeed feasible, and we've seen that happen. As a robustness check, Brent and I also hand-coded all the 5-digit occupations. So I think there's maybe 600, 700 5-digit occupations. And just as a sanity check, Brent and I each separately went through those and said, could you do this at home? Based on nothing more than 2 Chicago Booth profs' introspection about this. And so that is what you see in the second column here is our manual alternative. So on teaching, I guess we were a little more pessimistic about the elementary school teachers. We said that couldn't happen at home. So we said 85%, whereas our ONET survey-based method said 98%. But you can see that these are very highly correlated. So we report both results in the paper, but everything I show you from here on out is going to be based on the ONET survey, and because it just accords or correlates so closely with what we did in terms of this manual classification that we did by hand. Okay, so these are the occupations. If you sort of think about the characteristics of people that tend to work in occupations at the top of the list versus the bottom of the list, just introspect, from sort of casual observation, that these are sort of more skill intensive, more high paid occupations at the top of the list. And those that are less able to be performed at home tend to have lower wages. So that's one of the facts that people have highlighted almost immediately. So a number of people made different charts for this. We reported it in the text of the paper. We actually weren't the first people to make a scatter plot. That was Avju and Nayar in a column for the Brookings Institution. The Wall Street Journal made the scatter plot as well. Here's our version of the scatter plot. On the horizontal axis, what you see is the share of jobs that can be done at home according to our classification. And on the vertical axis is the median hourly wage in 2018. All the numbers I'm reporting that use wages or use employment counts for the United States are from the year 2018. And you can see that those occupations that can be performed at home tend to have higher average wages, something in the sort of 20 to 40 or a little bit above dollars per hour kind of wage. And for those that were very difficult or impossible to perform at home for large fractions of the occupations, there's this big cluster of occupations here that have wages that are more in the $15 to $20 an hour range. The biggest exception, and maybe this is changing, but our measures say that healthcare practitioners mostly cannot do their jobs at home. And those are the exception in terms of being a low work from home occupation that has a high median hourly wage. And clearly our scores here are based on pre-pandemic conditions. If you've been seeing news about a lot of the sort of innovations in the telehealth space in terms of trying to provide remote medicine, maybe this dot's going to be moving to the right as technology and what's feasible changes. But in our scoring of it based on pre-pandemic characteristics, doctors are sort of the outlier here in terms of high wage but low ability to work from home. Simon Monge and Laura Pilasoff and Alex Weinberg, Simon's our colleague at U Chicago, extended our work with a small tweak to the measure, sort of taking averages at the 3-digit level in order to connect it to the current population survey. And so they were able to say a lot about the kinds of people or the characteristics of individuals that work in these kind of occupations. And what they found quite, starkly was that workers in occupations that have lower ability to work from home are more likely to be economically vulnerable in the sense that they're more likely to be non-white, lower income, rent as opposed to own their dwellings, lack a college degree, and lack employer-provided health insurance. And so this ability to work from home, if you think, is going to cause economic distress, it looks like it's going to widen economic disparities in the sense that there's sort of an initial level of inequality associated with the kinds of people that have jobs that can be performed at home versus those that can't. Okay, this is a map of the United States that shows you variation in terms of the share of jobs that can be done at home across different metropolitan areas. There's about 370 some in the United States. This is probably not terribly helpful if you aren't intimately familiar with America's 370 largest cities, but let me just highlight that just by looking at the legend alone, you can see that there's incredible variation in terms of the highest shares exceed 50%, more than half of jobs can be done at home, whereas the number at the bottom end of the legend is something less than 20%. So to give you a little more flavor on this and connect it with the geographic variation in economic characteristics, here's amongst the 100 largest metropolitan areas, the top 10 and the bottom 10 in terms of their share of jobs that can be performed at home. So for parts of Silicon Valley, for San Jose and San Francisco, for tech hubs that are kind of eds and meds clusters like Washington, D.C. or the Triangle in North Carolina or Boston, you have numbers in the high 40s, almost half of the jobs are able to be performed at home. In the bottom 10, as you're looking at some older manufacturing hubs, some tourist destinations like Las Vegas, these numbers are 30% or below. In the next 4 columns, we plot these cities' metropolitan characteristics, the fraction of the residents who have a college degree or higher, a bachelor's degree or higher, the median household income in terms of thousands of dollars, the fraction of the residential population who are white, and the fraction of the residential population that are living in owner-occupied housing. The bivariate correlation between the share of jobs and the BA share and the median household income is very strong and positive. As you're looking at cities that have more college graduates and higher income levels, a bigger fraction of their jobs can be performed at home. It turns out that the bivariate correlation between the share of jobs and the fraction of residents who are white and the home ownership rate is actually negative. And so this is just an important reminder to sort of distinguish between people and places when making these kind of comparisons. If you go back and look at the Monge, Pilasoff, Weinberg numbers, those that were able to work from home were more likely to be white, more likely to own their dwellings. Now, it turns out that as you go to big cities like Washington, D.C., San Francisco, there are more renters and more diverse populations in terms of the racial composition. And so that's important to think about within city versus between city differences, in the sense that, yeah, half the jobs in San Francisco and San Jose can be performed at home. Remember that those, tech workers who are able to work from home are probably depending on people that cannot work from home to deliver their groceries and work in those, Amazon warehouses that are allowing them to receive shipments at their doorstep. And so I think it's important here to distinguish between people and places. Okay, then we look at the share of jobs that can be performed at home by industry. The top 5, these are naturally connected to the occupations I already showed you. The top 5 are education, professional, scientific, technical services, management of companies. At the bottom, you have construction, retail, farming, accommodation, and food services. These numbers are not as stark in the terms of there's no 100% and there's no 0% here, because every industry involves a mix of occupations in the sense that there are managers and IT support, et cetera. So relative to the comparisons across occupations, this comparison across industries is sort of moved to the interior of the unit interval a little bit. Okay, so those are the numbers. Those are the sort of headline numbers that we reported for the United States in the paper. Let me now turn to talking a little bit about what our classification does and does not capture. Okay, so we think of our measure as being a very important input, but only one input into questions about what's going to happen during the pandemic. How do you assess today's labor market outcomes? So our measure describes whether a job can be done entirely at home. And so if we head into the pandemic and you have this shelter-in-place order from the government, there are 3 things that can happen. You can be an essential employee, and so keep working on site. You can work from home, or you can be laid off. And we don't expect everybody who can't perform their entire occupation at home to be immediately laid off. We expect that there's going to be a lot of homebound employees that in the short run might perform parts of their jobs at home, right? And so this means that it's not going to be immediate to take our measure and translate it into unemployment rates or translate it into lost output, because we expect that we'll see a lot of partial performance, whereas our measure says, can you do the entire job at home? Our measures are derived from these ONET surveys. The ONET surveys are the 2018 wave describing pre-pandemic occupational content. And we certainly expect that businesses are going to adapt their operations and reallocate tasks and redefine jobs in order to cope with the pandemic. So we expect that we'll see some adjustment. And generally, you would expect the long-run elasticities to be bigger in absolute value than the short-run elasticities. So we would expect that businesses are going to become more flexible over time and start changing the nature of occupations. And I'll, at the end, in the more speculative section, I'll sort of tell you early survey evidence we've seen on how businesses are adapting. And so our numbers sort of, given it's based on pre-pandemic occupational content, probably most informative when there's the least flexibility and least time to adapt. So it might be a short run number, and of course it'll be interesting to trace how these occupational characteristics evolve over time. Importantly, we think of our feasibility measure as being a supply side measure. It's something like describing the production possibility set in terms of telling you what could be done at home. It doesn't speak to demand. And this is going to be important in a couple of respects. One is essential workers are exempt from these shelter-in-place orders by the government generally. And so if you're a doctor, you can't work from home, but also your services are desperately needed at this time. And so there's plenty of people that are just performing their essential jobs and continuing to work. And second is that's one reason that you wouldn't take our feasibility measure about production possibilities and immediately translate it into an unemployment forecast. So Eric Hurst and 8 other co-authors have a paper looking at the ADP payroll processing company, their data as a kind of real-time measure that comes out quite quickly. And what they were showing, at least for the April jobs numbers, was that in some very low work from home industries, there were huge job losses. So retail and restaurants had employment losses of something like down 50% in April. But there were some other industries that we classify as low work from home industries, like couriers and messengers and non-store retail jobs, where employment was actually rising. Employment in these two NAICS codes is up something like 15% in the middle of March, in the middle of April, according to our colleagues' work. And that's not so surprising in the sense that those of us that are working from home have been very dependent on grocery delivery and Amazon sending me, you know, a Wi-Fi upgrade because my home internet wasn't quite up to snuff when the pandemic started. So essential employees are working. Our feasibility measure is about the supply side. And in order to say something about what's going to actually play out in terms of the equilibrium employment, you need to connect it with the demand side as well. And then this is important to flag in terms of thinking about output. We want to talk about productivity as well. And there's a number of reasons why you might be more or less productive at home. Maybe not having to travel saves you a lot of jet lag or whatever, and maybe online is more convenient. But I think in the short run, this was far from the ideal experiment in terms of a lot of people were forced to pivot quickly to working at home and may not have made all the sort of complementary investments they would want to make. And in the context of the pandemic, it's not just work that's moved to home. There's a whole lot of other stuff that's shut down. And in a separate piece, you know, the sort of most obvious experience has been the contrast between those that have kids at home and those that don't, right? Some of us are sort of writing papers after we've cooked dinner and put the kids to bed at like 9 p.m. to midnight being your, you know, research block of time while the children are sleeping. And so Joe Vavra and Christina Patterson and I have written a separate note about childcare obligations, which just makes the very simple point in terms of thinking about the sequence and how we reopen the economy. Some of the government sequences, at least in the United States, propose to send people back to work even while schools and daycares are closed. And obviously, if you have parenting obligations or childcare obligations, that means that your productivity at home while schools and daycares are closed could be very different from what we might be talking about if you didn't have these simultaneous childcare obligations that were being induced by pandemic conditions. And then the last point to just make is to think about output. We need to know about the complementarity or substitutability of work from home and non-work from home occupations, right? So if you're a manufacturing manager who can technically work from home, but all the employees that you supervise can't be on the production line on the factory floor, then even though some fraction of the tasks that your firm is performing can be done at home, if it's Leontief in these tasks, then you know your output is still going to be zero. So there's some additional elasticities that we need to know in order to say what's going to happen to output, what's going to happen to GDP. And so we sort of get you the shares that you need to know sort of how many of these jobs can't be performed at home, but you would also want to know something about the elasticities of substitution in that production function that aggregates those tasks. Okay, so we see our measures as an important input to some of these questions. All right, I'm going to briefly talk about how many jobs can be done at home in other economies. The concordance work is important, but in the interest of time, I'll be brief. We have to map 6-digit codes for the United States, and we map them to 2-digit international standard classification of occupation codes, and it's many to many, so see the paper for how we handle some weighting. Then there's some context concerns, which is we've used surveys that describe US occupations, which means we're assuming sort of US technology, the US division of tasks across different occupations, et cetera. And implicitly, we're assuming US sort of levels of information and communication technologies infrastructure that are necessary for working at home. If we move to other countries that have internet connections that are primarily driven by people using 3G, 4G smartphones and not home broadband internet connections, then some of the assumptions we're making about what you can do at home might not apply in those circumstances. And so this is the concordance stuff that I'll be brief on. Basically, we grab International Labor Organization data that gives you employment counts for 86 economies by their 2-digit occupation code. And ideally, we'd have a unique mapping from the 6-digit US code to the 2-digit international code, but it doesn't. It's many to many, and so we have to make an allocation assumption. And that means that when we report the share of jobs that can be done at home in each country, there's actually going to be variation across countries in the number or fraction that we report within a 2-digit bucket of occupations because of this many to many allocation procedure. Okay, so when we do that, here's the scatter plot. On the horizontal axis is GDP per capita from the IMF in 2019, adjusted for purchasing power parity. And this is a collection of 86 economies, 85 plus the United States, that report jobs numbers that are quite comprehensive for 2015 or later. So there's more countries in the data set, but these are the ones that reported observations that had good coverage and were for a recent year. And you can see that there's this striking pattern. I mean, Luxembourg is a very high outlier, both in terms of its income level, and more than half the jobs in that country can be done at home. But there's this very clear positive relationship in which, as you go from left to right, moving from poorer countries to higher income economies, you're seeing that a larger and larger fraction of jobs can be performed at home according to our classification based on these occupational characteristics. And so that raises all kinds of concerns about the course of the pandemic, in the sense of how you cope with it if you're in a rich economy where something like 40% of jobs can be done at home is going to be very different than if you're down here in the sort of teens. These economies are probably more vulnerable given their income levels for a number of reasons, healthcare capacity, et cetera. But the fraction of jobs that can be done from home is another important element, and it's just a very small number in these lower income economies. Okay, there's room for improvement when looking outside the United States. And so I'm briefly going to talk about the related literature. So the ILO data comes at the 2-digit level. Individual countries report their jobs count oftentimes at the 4-digit level. And so people studying individual countries, Australia, Malaysia, South Africa, Spain, United Kingdom, have already taken our scores and concorded them at the 4-digit level instead of the 2-digit level in order to come up with more precise estimates. And every single piece of code and data that our paper uses is online on GitHub. We have a full replication package. And so if you're studying this topic in your particular economy, I'd encourage you to use our replication package and improve upon that sort of concordance, that crosswalk. More substantively, in terms of the economics, there's thinking about the appropriate context and adjustments you might want to make when porting our numbers outside the United States. So for example, when Andy Carr and Amy Thornton applied it to South Africa, they said, well, teachers are classified as able to work from home by Dingel and Nyman, but in South Africa, most primary and secondary teachers can't work from home because they don't have good internet access, or the students don't have good internet access. And so they took our measure and said, no, you've assumed something about a home internet connection that's not a good assumption in the South African context. Okay, so that's one kind of concern to highlight. The second context concern is raised by this nice paper by Gottlieb, Grobesbeck, and Paschke. They say, if in contrast you assume that all farmers can work from home, the aggregate work from home ability in poor countries is actually going to be bigger than that of rich countries. So we've said, thinking about these characteristics, can you do this at your home office? If you work outdoors every day, you can't perform the task at home. But if we're talking about rural farmers who live on the land that they're working, then it's conceivable that they could not be inside their home, but be farming, producing their agricultural output in a way that's consistent with social distancing, in the sense of, if it's mostly members of the household that are employed or providing the labor on the farm, as opposed to a bunch of agricultural laborers working in a group of unrelated people, it's conceivable that social distancing restrictions could be entirely compatible with farming activity continuing. And if that's the case, then because agricultural employment is a very large share of employment in low-income countries, that could potentially reverse the pattern that I was just showing you on that previous scatter plot. Okay, so the best way to address the concern that our method is US centric in terms of using US characteristics is to apply our method to domestic surveys. And so the first person to do this was Fernando Saltiel at Duke and McGill, who took a World Bank survey called Skills Towards Employability and Productivity that covers 10 low and middle income countries, and asked somewhat similar questions. So he used the analogous questions available in the STEP survey, and the numbers that he came up with were that the share of jobs that can be done at home ranged from 5% to 23%, and is positively related to GDP per capita. And so there are 5 economies that appear both in our ILO data and in Saltiel's STEP data. For 3 of them, their discrepancy is only a couple percentage points. For Ghana, we say 14%, Saltiel says 5%. For Laos, our ILO numbers say 21%, and his say 9%. And so Della Porta and Pena have documented more broadly, if you take Saltiel's survey responses for Bolivia and Colombia and apply them to 23 Latin American economies, these numbers are always lower than the Dingel and Nyman scores. And so if you take surveys from poor countries and use those job characteristics, it seems like the general pattern is that the gap between rich and poor countries is even bigger than it looks like if you take the US job characteristics and apply them to poor countries. Okay, so I'm running out of time, but let me make two final sort of comments. One is about real-time evidence, and one is about the future of remote work. So people have started running online surveys asking who's working from home, and we're seeing slightly different results. So I described this literature is still ongoing, but Eric Brynjolfsson and co-authors ran a Google consumer survey in the first week of April and found that half of people were working at home. That seems high relative to our number, and there might be concerns about selection into who participates in these Google consumer surveys. When I say that this is, real-time evidence, I mean that they're running the surveys in real time. I also mean that it's currently developing. So Alexander Bick just sent me this number last night. They've just posted this paper. They're running something they call the real-time population survey in the US that mimics the current population survey. And their number is 35% of people that had a job in May were working from home. So this number in terms of level is very close to what we estimated, the 37% for the United States. And their paper at a glance says that across industries, the outcomes are very correlated with what our measures suggest in terms of which industries are working at home. And Nick Bloom and co-authors run a decision maker panel in the UK. They have 37% of people working from home in 2 waves of the survey for both April and May. So that's the real-time evidence. That's emerging. That's other people's research, but that's a very exciting part of the literature that's developing. Let me use my last minute to just toss out some speculation about the future of remote work. So the question, or one question that people are asking is in-person work that's concentrated in large cities going to diminish as a result of the crisis? And there's 2 views here. One is coming from urban economics. One camp might say, no, this is a debate we already had in the late 90s when broadband internet became available. There was this hypothesis about the death of distance. And a bunch of skilled sectors could have moved to very remote locations and been performed over the internet. In fact, what we've seen in recent decades is that those high skilled sectors that Brent and I have classified as possible to be working from home are exactly the sectors that have been concentrating in big cities in the last couple of decades. Don Davis and I have done work documenting that. And there's also recent work by Eckert, Ganapati, and Walsh showing that it's these jobs that could be done remotely that are in fact the things concentrated in San Francisco that are driving up really high rents. The folks that say yes might say that this time is different for 3 reasons. Remote work might become more prevalent either because this is a forced experiment. Maybe people need a nudge. They were underestimating it beforehand, and now they're going to change their opinion. Second, maybe there's path dependence due to sunk investments. There could be hysteresis, or maybe the fundamentals have changed. If the pandemic means that there's always a higher risk of disease in cities, maybe that just makes them less attractive. I'm going to end by just showing you 2 surveys that I've found people are running. Adam Ozimek on Upwork is the surveys for the top 3 graphics. The bottom 2 come from IHEID Consulting. So a nudge story might say people are going to have new information about what working from home is like. And this survey that Adam Ozimek ran of 1,500 hiring managers says less than 10% said this is going worse than expected. Most people, the majority, are reporting this went somewhat better or much better than expected working at home. So either people had very low it's possible that people had very low expectations before the pandemic, but things are going better than expected. So perhaps revised beliefs mean that more people will work from home. And these numbers on the bottom are a survey of executives and small, medium business owners about adopting new tools. About a quarter to a third of folks are using new tools. Video conferencing is the most prevalent tool being adopted. What I want to quickly highlight here is that tool usage will become permanent after COVID. So amongst those guys that are investing in new digital tools, something like 4 out of 5 or 9 out of 10 are saying that they're going to use these tools permanently, and that's going to permanently shift the way that their company does work. And so that suggests that maybe this work from home thing will be different this time. But I've exceeded my 40 minutes, so let me just wrap up here. We produced a feasibility measure based on US surveys that describe job characteristics in pre-pandemic conditions. Our estimate was 37% of US jobs. There's clear inequality across people. There's clear differences across countries where rich countries are better able to work from home. There's some important amendments or using country-specific measures, and that caveat about farming is a big one. But in general, it appears to be a very robust result amongst different researchers here that it's much harder to work from home in poor countries than in rich countries. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John. That was very interesting. I have quite a few questions here that came through the Q&A and people raising their hands. So let me take them in chronological order. The first two are from the Q&A. We have a question from America Connery, who's asking whether the crisis, the COVID crisis and the change in the work pattern will make the initial inequality issues even starker. So did it make the world worse in that sense? What's your view?
Yeah, so based on pre-pandemic characteristics, we would have predicted that being able to work from home is an asset in terms of you don't have such a stark income versus health risk trade-off. So based on our measure, we would have said, yeah, that would be a reasonable prediction. I would point to the work by Simon Monge and the work by Eric Hurst in terms of what we've seen from the real-time jobs numbers is, yes, like low-wage workers were much more likely to lose their job. So it does seem that if you were just ranking people by income levels pre-pandemic, that the initial labor market consequences have widened inequality, yes.
Okay. Next question we have from Patrick Wall. So as to be with what we mean by home and pointing more specifically that there's a lot of heterogeneity, so some home are better suited to work from there and others are not so well suited.
Yes, because people that were, that's definitely a good point. I've highlighted that in one respect in terms of thinking of the childcare obligations, and I did mention the sort of internet connections. Those are two very salient things in terms of sources inequality across the United States in terms of you need a good internet connection, and people that have children but have some childcare option available to them are much better off. We've seen some of this, not in my work, but in other stuff about student performance with remote learning. You know, whether you're able to take classes online at home depends on, do you have 3 siblings but only 2 computers at home? Then that's going to be difficult. And let me point out that the folks that were excited about remote work and you know, advocating for it weren't necessarily imagining that everybody was going to be trapped in their bedroom or their living room, right? We were talking about this sort of, well, remote work means you can be anywhere you want. You can be working out of a Starbucks or a coffee shop, et cetera. And so I think that this heterogeneity in home conditions, certainly the childcare obligations, most people when they made decisions about their household and fertility decisions were assuming a market for childcare. They were assuming that schools and daycares were going to be open, that their nanny could come to their house. And so there's this new source of inequality in terms of childcare obligations that's sort of orthogonal to most other characteristics. And so home conditions are certainly important. And that's why I think, you know, there might be reasons to think that remote work or work from home will be more popular after this pandemic. A reason to be pessimistic is this is a very forced experiment. This is far from ideal conditions. People were forced to go move home and start working from home on very short notice without appropriate arrangements or investments in some cases. And so it's entirely possible that the pandemic will leave people with a bad taste in their mouth and they'll say that working from home is unattractive based on this kind of forced experiment.
Good. Then we have a question from Victoria Vernon, who raised her hand. Victoria, if I may ask you to unmute.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, if you can unmute.
Okay.
Okay, we're good. We're here. So I'll let you ask your question directly.
Thank you for taking my question. So I understand that you focused on telework versus no telework at all, but I am curious whether you looked at all at occasional teleworkers. So quite likely that most jobs can be done partially from home. Remote work 1 day a week or 2 days a week or 3 days a week versus 5 days a week. And I wonder what you may have, whether you've looked at it and what trends you may have seen, whether there are more jobs or fewer jobs in occasional telework.
So our initial measure did not do this sort of partial telework scenario. It's true that the pre-pandemic surveys asked it both ways in terms of, do you work from home, you know, primarily from home or just occasionally? So trying to distinguish between the folks that are, you know, working remotely 5 days a week versus somebody that's answering some emails after dinner at home, but is primarily going to the office. And you saw big differences in numbers there. Like in the UK, it was 5% primarily at home versus 29% had done some work at home. The reason that we didn't think that the survey questions that we were leveraging had sufficient sort of granularity to allow us to distinguish between the person that could do 2 days a week in the office, but then, the remaining 3 days, the remaining 60% of their tasks could be done at home. And so we took the sort of stark binary indicator of yes, no on the entire job. The way we've defined that, saying, could you do this entirely at home, is acknowledging that it is possible to do parts of your job at home, but we didn't think that the survey measures were going to support kind of drawing those fine distinctions. You can, and the subsequent literature has done this, instead of using our Stark 0-1 indicator, use a more continuous measure where if there's like 3 different circumstances that suggest you can't work from home, that's probably an easier case than if you failed all 17 of our conditions, where you work outside, never use email, need safety equipment, and operate heavy machinery, et cetera. If all of those are true, then there's this notion that that really can't be done at home versus something where it might be possible to do half or 3/4 of the job at home. So I think the subsequent literature has moved in that direction. It's very highly correlated with our yes/no answer. But I do expect businesses are going to redefine jobs and allocate the bundles of tasks that constitute jobs in order to accommodate these kind of needs that just weren't on people's radar prior to the pandemic.
Let me start here also with a related question. It would be interesting to know if we can have a sense of the ability to work at home depending on the duration. So it's one thing to work at home for 2 months. I don't have to go to the office. 4 months is getting tougher. After 6 months, I have to do some tasks in the office. So has there been any research to get a sense of feasibility at home by duration of the at-home spell?
I'm not aware of research that's gone into this yet. Let me point to 2 related things. One is just the priors I hold, which is generally we think long-run elasticities are bigger than short-run elasticities. So we think that if you need to invest in new digital tools, et cetera, that this experience will get better over time as you have more chances to adapt. So that would make you think that it should be better in the long run than short run. The countervailing piece is that I think that there's a number of elements of, say, social capital or collegiality that have a depreciation rate attached to them. So Brent and I wrote this paper entirely online, from the confines of our own home. But Brent and I have been colleagues for 5.5 years and have a good relationship to build upon when launching a project. If I was going to start working with someone who I hadn't met before and only, cooperate on a project with them 40 hours a week on the basis of a Zoom call and a webcam, that may not have the same rapport. And so what I'm trying to articulate is that, in the short run, remote work can draw upon assets that were built up, relationships that were established on a face-to-face basis. And so that is going to not be feasible if we're all, working from home in the very long run. People are going to have to find new tools and make new relationship investments, in that remote scenario. The other thing I would point to was the survey evidence, the sort of first impressions evidence from Upwork that I mentioned briefly in my slides. So the advantages, what was nice about it, the top 2 answers were no commute and reduction of non-essential meetings, right? Those both had like 45 to 50% responses. And so it's, true that people are gonna enjoy those. But the issues that they listed were in terms of disadvantages were technological issues, distractions at home, and reduced team cohesion. And so reduced team cohesion would be an example of something where if you've got established relationships, people, I think in the short run, that can go remote quite easily. But in the long run, I think people really, want to be in the same room and have face-to-face conversations. And we know from, some famous companies that have been remote, that are remote native or digital native companies where they've always had their geographically distributed employees. Those companies usually have something where their employees get together on a retreat for like an intense 3-day get together every quarter or every 6 months or so. So we know that it's important to kind of occasionally get together face to face, even if we can be remote for a good chunk of the time.
Okay, I see that Ugo Panizza has raised his hand. So Ugo, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. It's more a comment than a question, and it's based on a question that was asked before. And I want to highlight how important this work is to estimate the effect of the pandemic on poverty. We have all the results that said basically the elasticity of poverty to growth is about 1. And I think all the current estimates of the pandemic on poverty are based on this idea that this poverty moves, you know, one-to-one with growth. But your result, as you mentioned before, might indicate that this specific shock to growth might have large effect on inequality. So the effect on poverty might be much higher than what is implied by you know, these current estimates, which are based on this assumption of elasticity of one. Might be with some exception for the ultra poor who farm, you know, the piece of land outside their house. But so it was just a comment.
I completely agree that the aggregate GDP hit, and then assuming that that's sort of passed through, you know, proportionately to everybody in the income distribution would not be a good way of thinking about the crisis, in the sense that, you know, this piece of this work from home ability and lots of other pieces of evidence that I've seen about liquidity constraints and other stuff, all of these suggests that the pandemic, in terms of its economic consequences, is having very uneven effects and generally widening inequality relative to sort of the pre-pandemic baseline. I completely agree.
I see that Charles Wiprosh also has raised his hand. So Charles, go ahead. Charles, can you unmute? Looks like we're having an issue. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Talking about experiments with working at home, I remember a paper, I don't remember the authors, but it was run with Uber. I don't know if you were aware of that, John. They offered their workforce to choose between working at home and not working at home. A big chunk of people, not the drivers, of course, the staff, and people committed, who wanted to try it, committed to 1 year. After 1 year, about, if I remember well, half of them wanted to go back to the office. And the explanation was, well, if you want, chatting by the coffee machine was an important factor. Being isolated at home is not fun. And the fact that promotions, the people who are working at home were getting way less promotions than those who were chatting by the coffee machine.
Yeah, I think there's a couple. This is one example where there might be path dependence. So suppose that most people are working in the office and you want to deviate from that sort of norm by remote working. People might worry that you're shirking, or say, you know, why is this person not in the office? Or they, you know, instead of measuring your outputs, might just be measuring your inputs in terms of how often do I see them sitting at their desk. And so there's a number of reasons why, if you're the only person working from home, you know, maybe the inferences are different than in a pandemic situation where now there's this coordinated move where everybody's been forced to work from home. And so that, you know, might be a bit different than the prior experiments. I don't know the Uber experiment. I know a paper by Nick Bloom, I think it's in the QJE, where they ran an experiment with the cooperation of a call center company in China. And clearly, call center telecommunications is something you can do from home if you've got a good telecommunications setup. And some of the important details there in terms of thinking about productivity consequences was they were supposed to work like their usual hours, 9 to 5 in a room. My understanding is that they're working 9 to 5 in a room in the house that the non-employees, like other family members, couldn't come into the room or weren't supposed to come into the room. So it was, you know, a high quality home office setup, as opposed to the sort of pandemic, you know, makeshift arrangements we have right now. And if I'm remembering the results from Bloom's paper correctly, that had a relatively positive effect on productivity, in the sense of those that were treated by the experiment succeeded in working from home. And so clearly, you know, the pandemic experience we're having is different in a number of dimensions from these sort of experiments that companies are thinking about running in maybe better circumstances.
So we have only a few minutes left. Let me just pick some question we get from the Q&A, and I'm going to summarize the themes and I let you pick the ones you want, right? This is like more of a comment, I guess, from Vincenzo Galasso, pointing to a paper with a similar paper. It's been working on 2 waves in 12 countries, and they get broadly similar results from that you get. In terms of the question, Fayang Shi asked whether if a job is done from home, whether the productivity can actually be quite different and if you do it from the office. And there's also two quick questions. One about the impact of gender equity. And finally, last question about whether some profession that requires interaction with an audience would be more permanently affected. So I'll let you pick among these themes which one you want to address.
Great. I'm excited to hear about people that are running real-time surveys. So Vincenzo, if you could email me the details of your paper, that'd be great. On gender inequality, Brent and I didn't tackle this directly, but I would point to some work by Jane Olmsted Rumsey and Matthias Depke and two more co-authors, where they have explicitly written a nice piece about gender inequality and COVID. And what they highlight, for example, is that the COVID recession is different in the sense that typically male employment rates are more pro-cyclical, in the sense of think about construction and manufacturing kind of riding the business cycle and being industries that have higher male shares of employment. And so the COVID pandemic is different because it's hitting female employment quite hard relative to male compared to a normal business cycle recession. And then this childcare issue, with which those co-authors and in my work with Vavra and Patterson, we focused on, is that there's kind of a traditional division of labor along gender lines in a lot of households that, with the closure of schools and daycares, is now being revisited. And that is another forced experiment. I don't really have a basis for projecting whether it'll change gender norms or not, but I think it's sort of a very important issue that ought to be highlighted in terms of now that everybody's working from home, maybe people are, maybe some of the invisible labor will be a little more visible to those that have usually been off at the office, but maybe some of the division of those tasks might be changed by the pandemic as well. On the performance audience stuff, I think it's too early to tell how it's going to come back, but I've been seeing ESPN broadcasting, ball players playing video games as their way to fill airtime. So clearly those that perform for a live audience are in a tough situation in the short run, but also there's a question about how demand for seeing the live version of a concert where you're shoulder to shoulder next to everyone else, until we have a vaccine, or if we think there's going to be permanently elevated risk, that demand for those kind of goods is going to go way down. We've already seen that in the restaurant and retail numbers. Some people using like cell phone tracking data have shown that even before the government ordered restaurants to close, demand for restaurants was way down because people take private actions to guard themselves against those kind of dangers. So whether that's permanent or not depends on a lot of public health questions where I'm not an expert at all about our prospects for a vaccine, but I think that's going to be a very important consideration going forward.
Good. I think that was interesting. We went slightly over time, so we have to conclude here. So many thanks, Jonathan, for presenting this paper, and also thanks to Mariolina for making this all work smoothly. And we'll be welcoming you in a week from now for the next issue of this e-seminar. And until then, all the best. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.